Late May 1940, the historic shores of Dunkirk were transformed into a literal, living manifestation of hell on earth. Plumes of thick, suffocating black smoke from targeted British oil reserves rose miles into the sky, blotting out the sun, while the chilling, continuous thunder of heavy German artillery and the merciless screaming of Luftwaffe bombers racked the coastline. Trapped on a narrow, exposed strip of wet sand, over 350,000 elite British and French soldiers were completely pinned against the freezing, uncaring waters of the English Channel. Their supply lines were severed, their heavy weaponry was shattered, and behind them, the iron ring of Adolf Hitler's victorious panzer divisions was systematically tightening its lethal grip. In London, Winston Churchill prepared the British nation for the imminent, catastrophic announcement of a total military surrender, a disaster that would effectively leave Great Britain completely defenseless against a Nazi cross-channel invasion. But right at the absolute precipice of total annihilation, one of the most mysterious, highly debated turning points of World War II occurred. Adolf Hitler issued a sudden, shocking halt order, freezing his advanced tanks just miles from the defenseless beaches, and granting the Allied forces a desperate, miraculous window of time. What followed was Operation Dynamo, a legendary, chaotic evacuation where an improvised armada of military destroyers and hundreds of civilian fishing boats, private yachts, and lifeboats braved a storm of fire to rescue the beating heart of the British military.
Yet the miracle of Dunkirk was merely the opening act of a larger, darker national tragedy. With the British Expeditionary Force evacuated and effectively disarmed, the German Wehrmacht turned the full, uninterrupted weight of its mechanized fury back toward the interior of France. Under the strategic operational codename Fall Rot, Plan Red, more than 100 German divisions launched a massive, coordinated offensive across the Somme and Aisne rivers. This was the final, agonizing death march of the French Third Republic. It was a chaotic campaign defined by the frantic, high-speed maneuvers of Erwin Rommel's Ghost Division, a cynical political stab in the back from Benito Mussolini's Italy, and a total collapse of national willpower that would see the historic streets of Paris surrendered without firing a single shot. In a matter of mere weeks, the once mighty French nation would be forced to bow its head in absolute, humiliating capitulation, signed inside a historic railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, an act of raw, totalitarian vengeance that would shatter the balance of global power and leave Adolf Hitler as the undisputed, terrifying master of continental Europe.
By May 24, 1940, the fate of the British Expeditionary Force hung by a single fraying thread. The advanced panzer spearheads of General Heinz Guderian and General Ewald von Kleist had captured the critical channel ports of Boulogne and Calais. Their leading tanks were sitting a mere 15 miles from Dunkirk, looking down upon the last remaining escape hatch for the Allied armies. The British military was effectively cornered, and Guderian's engines were idling, ready to launch the final, crushing armored assault that would close the pocket forever. It was at this exact micro-moment of absolute tactical certainty that Adolf Hitler intervened, issuing his historic Haltebefehl, the Halt Order. For 2 critical, uninterrupted days, the victorious German tanks sat completely stationary, forbidden from advancing into the defenseless pocket. For decades, historians have fiercely debated the true operational motive behind Hitler's shocking hesitation. The answer lies not in a sudden burst of mercy, but in a chaotic mixture of military logistics, political calculation, and toxic high command ego. General Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group A, was deeply concerned that the rapid, unchecked Blitzkrieg had left his tank tracks heavily worn and his armored divisions dangerously low on replacement parts. He feared that if his precious panzers were thrown into the low, swampy, and waterlogged drainage canal surrounding Dunkirk, they would become bogged down and easily picked off by desperate Allied defensive artillery.
Simultaneously,
Hermann Göring, the flamboyant and intensely ambitious commander of the Luftwaffe, made an arrogant political promise to Hitler. Göring guaranteed that his tactical bombers could completely annihilate the trapped Allied armies from the sky without risking a single German tank, ensuring that the supreme glory of the final victory would belong exclusively to the Nazi Air Force. Hitler, captivated by Göring's promises and eager to assert his absolute personal authority over his own conservative generals, signed the order. It would prove to be one of the greatest strategic blunders of his entire career. The two-day pause granted Great Britain a desperate, unhoped-for lifeline. On May 26th, the British Admiralty launched Operation Dynamo under the command of Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay. What unfolded over the next 9 days was an unprecedented, heroic naval mobilization. Because the main port of Dunkirk had been completely destroyed by Luftwaffe incendiary bombs, British destroyers could not dock along the shallow beaches. In response, the British government issued an emergency broadcast invoking an extraordinary armada known as the Little Ships of Dunkirk. Over 700 civilian vessels, private luxury yachts, wooden commercial fishing trawlers, Thames River fireboats, and modest pleasure cruisers braved the treacherous waters of the Channel. Operating under a relentless storm of Luftwaffe machine gun fire, navigating through fields of floating sea mines, and dodging heavy artillery shells, these civilian volunteers made countless trips from the English coast to the burning beaches, ferrying soldiers out to the larger naval warships waiting in deep water.
High above the coastline, the elite pilots of the Royal Air Force, flying their newly deployed Supermarine Spitfires, fought a brutal, exhausting war of attrition against Göring's bombers, successfully preventing the Luftwaffe from achieving total air superiority over the evacuation zones. By June 4th, the impossible miracle was complete. A staggering 338,000 Allied soldiers, including over 120,000 French troops, had been successfully evacuated from the jaws of death. But this miracle carried a bitter, devastating price. The British military had saved its biological heart, but it had abandoned 100% of its heavy equipment on the blood-stained sands of France. Over 60,000 vehicles, nearly 500 tanks, and thousands of heavy artillery pieces were left behind as scrap metal. Furthermore, the miracle of Dunkirk was built upon a profound, tragic sacrifice. A heroic rearguard of 40,000 elite French soldiers from the 12th Motorized Infantry Division held the perimeter of the town, fighting to their absolute last bullet against overwhelming German attacks to buy their British comrades time to escape. When the final British ship slipped into the fog, the remaining French defenders were left completely alone, facing an unyielding ring of German bayonets and a long, brutal march into a dark horizon of captive prisoner of war camps.
On June 5, 1940, any lingering hopes that the evacuation at Dunkirk would lead to a prolonged stalemate on the continent were violently crushed. The German Wehrmacht, having rapidly reorganized its supply lines and replenished its fuel reserves, launched Fall Rot, Plan Red. This was the final total strategic offensive designed to conquer the remainder of France. Over 140 combat-ready German divisions, including all 10 elite panzer units, were unleashed along a massive, continuous front stretching from the Somme River to the rolling banks of the Aisne. The defense of the fractured republic fell upon the shoulders of the newly appointed commander-in-chief, General Maxime Weygand. Weygand recognized that his military had lost its finest mechanized equipment in the north. Operating with a desperate, improvisational courage, he attempted to construct a new tactical line, the Weygand Line. He ordered his remaining troops to abandon all notions of linear defense and instead build deep, self-sustaining hedgehog fortresses inside village squares, stone farmhouses, and strategic crossroads. French soldiers were commanded to fight to the absolute death, allowing German tanks to bypass them so that the French artillery could destroy the vulnerable infantry following behind. For the opening 48 hours, this defensive system worked with surprising, bloody efficiency. French infantry units fighting with their backs against the wall inflicted severe casualties on the advancing German infantry, but the sheer relentless momentum of the Blitzkrieg was simply too vast to contain.
The man who systematically tore the Weygand Line into absolute shreds was a daring, intensely aggressive tactical mind who would become a living legend of modern armored warfare, Major General Erwin Rommel. Commanding the elite 7th Panzer Division, Rommel rejected every established rule of conventional military caution. He did not wait for his flanks to be secured. He did not wait for aerial reconnaissance, and he openly ignored the frantic, panicky radio messages from his own corps commander, orders to slow down. Rommel's unit operated with such incredible hyperextended velocity that it earned a terrifying historical nickname, Gespenster Division, the Ghost Division. The advance was so fast that neither the French High Command nor the German General Staff knew exactly where Rommel's tanks were at any given hour. Driving his panzers forward through the dark, under the cover of thick smoke screens and dust clouds, Rommel systematically bypassed the French hedgehog defenses, carving deep infected wounds into the open flesh of the French interior.
The speed of the Ghost Division created absolute tactical havoc. Rommel's tanks would frequently roll into sleepy French villages miles behind the shifting front lines, catching local French garrisons completely by surprise while they were eating lunch or sleeping in their barracks. In a matter of mere days, the 7th Panzer Division covered a staggering 200 miles, capturing thousands of concussed prisoners and seizing critical bridges across the Seine River before the defenders could even hook up the demolition charges. The thin, fragile line of the Wagen defense completely collapsed into a chaotic, fragmented retreat. The organized tactical structure of the French military ceased to exist. It was transformed into a desperate, stampeding mass of millions of terrified soldiers and civilian refugees clogging the roads, while the unstoppable steel tracks of the German panzers rumbled forward toward the ultimate cultural crown jewel of Western Europe, the defenseless capital of Paris. By June 10, 1940, the strategic death of France was no longer a matter of military speculation. It was an absolute mathematical certainty. As the broken, fragmented remnants of the French army drifted southward in a chaotic retreat, and the French government fled Paris in panic, another European dictator decided that the moment had arrived to claim his share of the spoils. In Rome, standing before a massive, roaring crowd from the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia, Benito Mussolini officially declared war on a dying France and Great Britain. For 9 months, Mussolini had kept Italy in a state of cautious non-belligerence, waiting to see which way the wind of history would blow. Now, seeing the Wehrmacht tear through the French interior, Duce confessed to his army chiefs, "I only need a few thousand dead so that I can sit at the peace conference as a man who has fought." The international reaction to Mussolini's opportunistic declaration was one of absolute visceral disgust. Across the Atlantic, United States President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was giving a commencement address at the University of Virginia. Discarding his prepared diplomatic text, Roosevelt spoke with a cold, righteous fury that electrified the free world, declaring, "On this 10th day of June 1940, the hand that held the dagger has struck it into the back of its neighbor."
Roosevelt's words formally signaled a profound geopolitical shift, marking the definitive end of American isolationist neutrality and opening the floodgates of unlimited material, industrial, and financial aid to Great Britain. But if Mussolini expected a glorious high-speed military parade across the French Riviera, he was about to face a staggering, deeply humiliating tactical reality. On June 21st, Mussolini unleashed the Italian Army Group West, a massive force of over 300,000 combat troops, supported by thousands of heavy artillery pieces. This immense force was ordered to breach the Alpine border and conquer southeastern France. The defense of this mountainous frontier rested upon the shoulders of the French Army of the Alps, commanded by General René Olry. Weygand had stripped Olry of almost all his modern tanks, regular infantry, and aircraft to feed the collapsing northern front. Olry was left with just 85,000 men, consisting mostly of specialized mountain troops, the chasseurs alpins, and local fortress reservists.
What followed was one of the most stunning, asymmetric defensive operations of the Second World War. Packed into narrow, ice-choked mountain passes and deep snowbanks, the Italian infantry columns moved forward without proper winter equipment, specialized alpine training, or coherent operational coordination. The French chasseurs alpins dug deep into concrete fortresses and camouflaged machine gun nests carved directly into the solid rock faces of the Alps, held their positions with absolute icy discipline.
Outnumbered 7-1, the French mountain units systematically dismantled the Italian offensives. French heavy artillery, pre-registered on every narrow pass and mountain trail, rained devastating, precise fire down upon the exposed Italian lines, completely freezing their advance in the snow. In the critical sector of Menton, a tiny garrison of just 9 French soldiers inside a reinforced concrete outpost on the border held off an entire Italian brigade for days, inflicting massive casualties. Mussolini's grand invasion was completely, embarrassingly paralyzed. The Italian army failed to advance more than a few miles into French territory, completely unable to break the spirit of a military that was simultaneously collapsing on the other side of the country.
By the second week of June 1940, the heavy, distant thunder of German artillery could be heard clearly in the historic heart of Paris. The legendary City of Light was systematically gripped by a cold, suffocating wave of existential panic. Millions of Parisian civilians, realizing that the shattered military front was rapidly dissolving into non-existence, abandoned their homes in a desperate bid to escape the approaching conquerors. The city's railway stations were transformed into scenes of absolute, primal chaos, with families fighting for space on the last remaining trains leaving the capital. More than 2 million people packed whatever belongings they could carry onto cars, bicycles, and wooden carts, clogging the southern highways in a massive, agonizing human exodus under a baking summer sun. Inside the historic ministries of the French government, the atmosphere was one of apocalyptic surrender. On June 10th, Premier Paul Reynaud and his entire cabinet packed their top-secret administrative archives and fled the capital in a frantic car convoy, moving first to Tours and later to the southwestern port city of Bordeaux. With the civilian administration gone and the military lines entirely bypassed, the newly appointed military governor of the capital, General Henri Dents, faced a shattering, historic decision. He could order his remaining infantry regiments to dig into the historic squares, turning the French capital into a bloody, ruinous urban fortress. But Dents recognized that such a move would lead to the total, cataclysmic annihilation of the architectural and cultural crown jewel of Western Europe. Precisely at midnight on June 10th, to save the historic monuments from the devastating wrath of German heavy artillery and Luftwaffe carpet bombing, the French High Command officially declared Paris an open city. This formal diplomatic status signaled to the advancing Wehrmacht that the capital was completely undefended and that the German forces could enter without facing a single bullet of resistance. At exactly 5:30 a.m. on the morning of June 14, 1940, the surreal nightmare became a historical reality. The heavily motorized divisions of General Fedor von Bock's Army Group B rolled into the silent, ghost-like avenues of Paris. The contrast was staggering. The grand boulevards that had once defined the vibrant cultural heart of the free world were completely, eerily empty. Shutters were drawn tightly over cafe windows, and the few remaining citizens stood completely stationary on the sidewalks, tears streaming silently down their faces, as the rigid, gray-clad boots of the German infantry marched in endless, mechanical synchronization down the Elysée, down the Champs-Élysées. The brass bands of the Wehrmacht played triumphant German military marches beneath the massive shadow of the Arc de Triomphe, while the massive black and red swastika flag of the Third Reich was slowly hoisted to the very top of the Eiffel Tower. A few days later, Adolf Hitler arrived in the captured capital for a secretive, lightning 3-hour tour. It was his first and only visit to Paris. Walking silently through the grand halls of the opera, posing for historical photographs against the backdrop of the Eiffel Tower, and standing over the tomb of Napoleon Bonaparte at the Invalides, the German dictator basked in the absolute pinnacle of his totalitarian triumph. The psychological backbone of the French nation was decisively shattered. The cultural capital of modern European civilization had fallen into the hands of a radical, unforgiving military empire in just 34 days of combat.
As German panzers systematically fanned out across the southern interior of France, the ultimate fate of the Republic was decided not by bayonets on the battlefield, but by furious, desperate political infighting inside the temporary capital of Bordeaux. Stripped of its industrial base and with over 6 million internal refugees sleeping on the streets, the French government was trapped in a state of absolute hyperventilating paralysis. Premier Paul Reynaud desperately argued that France should follow the historic Dutch option to move the president, the gold reserves, and the remaining navy to North Africa and continue fighting a global war using the vast resources of the French colonial empire. But Reynaud's strategic vision was violently opposed by a powerful defeatist faction within his own cabinet. This group was led by the aging, legendary 84-year-old hero of the First World War, Marshal Philippe Pétain, and the deeply cynical Commander-in-Chief, General Maxime Weygand. Pétain openly mocked the idea of continuing the struggle from Africa, coldly declaring to the cabinet that leaving French soil was the act of a coward, and that his sacred duty was to stay and suffer alongside the French people. He was absolutely convinced that Great Britain would be completely crushed by the Wehrmacht within 3 weeks, and that France needed to make peace immediately to secure a favorable position in Hitler's new European order. On the night of June 16th, completely exhausted by the relentless defeatism of his ministers and realizing he had lost the support of the council, Paul Reynaud resigned. Within minutes, the elderly Marshal Pétain stepped forward to seize absolute executive control of the state. The very next day, on June 17th, Pétain addressed the shattered, weeping nation over the public radio airwaves. His voice was frail, slow, and paternal, as he delivered a catastrophic psychological blow to the millions of citizens listening in absolute silence. Pétain formally announced, "It is with a heavy heart that I tell you today that we must cease the fight." He ordered his remaining generals to immediately establish direct contact with the German High Command to ask for armistice terms. Pétain's broadcast acted like an absolute chemical solvent on the remnants of the French military. Believing the war was officially over, entire French army corps threw down their weapons, abandoned their defensive positions along the Loire River, and voluntarily walked into German custody, completely breaking the remaining lines of national resistance. This political surrender marked the birth of the authoritarian collaborationist Vichy regime, a dark state that would actively betray its own democratic principles to hunt down dissidents and cooperate with the Nazi conquerors. But at that exact moment of absolute national darkness, an alternative, defiant path for France was born in the shadows. A virtually unknown junior two-star brigadier general named Charles de Gaulle, who had served briefly as Reynaud's Undersecretary of War, refused to bow his head to Pétain's capitulation. Recognizing that his life was in immediate danger from the new Vichy authorities, de Gaulle slipped onto a British military transport aircraft in Bordeaux and fled to London. On the evening of June 18, 1940, sitting inside a cold, dimly lit broadcasting studio at the BBC, de Gaulle spoke directly to the French people. His voice was firm, resonant, and burning with a fierce, historic defiance. De Gaulle uttered the immortal words that would form the bedrock of the French resistance. Has the last word been said? Must hope disappear? Is the defeat final? No. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. At that moment, de Gaulle stood completely alone. He had no army, no territory, and his own government had officially condemned him to death as a traitor. Yet his solitary voice, echoing across the radio waves, threw a lifeline of hope into the darkness, signaling to the world that the flame of the French Republic would refuse to die, even as its historic soil lay crushed beneath the iron heel of the conqueror. On June 22, 1940, the forest of Compiègne, situated just 50 miles north of Paris, became the stage for one of the most calculated, theatrical acts of geopolitical vengeance in human history. To sign the formal document of French capitulation, Adolf Hitler did not choose a grand palace or a modern military headquarters. Instead, he ordered his engineers to execute a stunning piece of historical choreography. German troops used heavy explosives to blast through the concrete walls of a French museum pavilion, extracting the legendary railway carriage number 2419D. This was the exact dining car in which the defeated German Empire had been forced to sign the humiliating armistice of 1918 at the end of the First World War. The carriage was rolled out onto the exact same set of tracks, in the exact same clearing, surrounded by the same ancient oak trees. At exactly 3:15 p.m., Hitler arrived at the site, accompanied by his highest military commanders, Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, and General Wilhelm Keitel. Walking with a rigid, theatrical stride, the German dictator stepped into the clearing. He stopped in front of a massive French granite monument dedicated to the 1918 victory, which read, "Here succumbed the criminal pride of the German Empire." Witnesses observed Hitler's face transfigure from cold arrogance to a look of absolute demonic triumph. He stepped inside the historic railway carriage and took the exact seat where the French Marshal Ferdinand Foch had sat 22 years earlier, looking across the table at the pale, broken French delegation led by General Charles Hunsinger. Hitler sat in total, icy silence for the opening 10 minutes, listening as General Keitel read the preamble to the German armistice terms. Then, in a final gesture of supreme contempt, Hitler stood up and walked out of the carriage, leaving his generals to dictate the brutal details of the surrender to the weeping French officers. The terms of the armistice were designed to completely castrate the French nation. France was violently severed into two distinct zones. The entire northern and western halves of the country, including Paris and the strategically critical Atlantic coastline, were placed under direct, brutal German military occupation. The southern half was left under the administrative control of Marshal Pétain's puppet government in Vichy. The mighty French military was reduced to a skeleton force of just 100,000 men, stripped of all tanks, heavy artillery, and aircraft. Furthermore, France was forced to pay an astronomical, back-breaking occupation debt of 400 million francs every single day to fund the upkeep of the German Wehrmacht. The Battle of France was over. In just 46 days of lightning warfare, the German Blitzkrieg had accomplished what the Kaiser's armies had failed to achieve in 4 long years of horrific trench warfare. The democratic superpower that had dominated continental Europe for generations had been completely, systematically dismantled. As the historic railway carriage at Compiègne was burned to ashes by German troops to prevent it from ever becoming a symbol of French revival, a dark, suffocating iron curtain descended over the European continent, leaving a solitary, isolated Great Britain to stand completely alone against the terrifying, unchallenged might of the Nazi Empire. This was the tragic finale of the fall of France, but the global struggle against the Axis powers was only just beginning. Every single week, we bring you new, in-depth breakdowns of the most critical battles, hidden strategies, and untold stories of World War II. To make sure you never miss the upcoming episodes on the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell. Your incredible support is what allows us to keep bringing these historical narratives to life. If you found this 2-part documentary compelling, please leave a like, and don't forget to drop your thoughts in the comment section below. Which tactical mistake do you think was the most fatal for France? We read and reply to every single comment. Thank you for watching, stay safe, and we will see you in the next video.